Pak Arif, Nên akeh sih. Iya. Lalu tempo uno. Para pare? Perché pare? Te pare, va bene? Oh, iya. Ya. Iya pala titata pahitawa, kaya wala hinga weki. Rundur. Iya.
Tes.
Iya. Savastella. Oh, bisi akeh kok menurut Raden. Iya.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. salam kebajikan, dan salam sehat untuk kita semua. Yang saya hormati, Employment and Labor Market Policies Specialist ILO Country Office for the Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Mr. Diego Re. Technical Labor Specialist in Public Employment Service, ILO Geneva, Ms. Anna Karim Palm Olson. Para seluruh pengantar kerja yang saya banggakan. Puji syukur kehadiran Tuhan Yang Maha Kuasa karena limpahan rahmat dan hidayahnya, sehingga kita dapat berkumpul melalui Zoom meeting dalam rangka webinar series layanan pengantar kerja bagi pelayan penyandang disabilitas di Indonesia. Dengan tema layanan pengantar kerja bagi penyandang disabilitas di Indonesia tahap 2 tahun 2024.
Good afternoon.
Acara selanjutnya, arahan yang akan disampaikan oleh Bapak Diego Rey, selaku Employment and Labor Market Policy Specialist, ILO Country Office for Indonesia and Timor-Leste. Kepada Bapak Diego Rey, kami persilakan.
Yeah, very good afternoon, everybody. Pleased to be here. For our second webinar of this series, we have with us my colleague, Anna Karin Olson, who is based in the Geneva headquarters. I will let her introduce herself. She will be talking specifically on the role of employment services, public employment services specifically, and of the employment counselors vis-a-vis helping potential job seekers. Anna, I'll give you the floor. Mr. Henry, if you could kindly mute thank you. Anna.
Yes, thank you very much, Diego. It's such a pleasure for me to be here with you, and good afternoon to everyone. Nice to see you, I would say almost again, because I was also part of the webinar yesterday to listen to Heba and her very interesting presentation. My name is Anna Karin Palmolson, as Diego already said, and I work now since 2 years as a technical specialist on labor market services in Geneva. But before then, I was working over 17 years with the Swedish Public Employment Services. And so this is really my specialty in that manner. So my background is very much being a practitioner and a specialist, as many of you of the Swedish Public Employment Services as well. I just want to make sure that we have...
Anna, you're muted now.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that we get the presentation up. I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I think it's supposed to be handled.
Yep. Colleagues from Binapenta.
It keeps muting. I'm sorry, I don't know why. So we will be talking to each other at 2 different occasions. We're starting today. Is someone muting me, or can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, because it continues to mute. I don't know why. So we will be speaking to each other on 2 occasions, and I expect you also to ask me questions and be very interactive with me. This first session will focus more on the role of the public employment services when it comes to including persons with disabilities, trying to maybe build upon a little bit on what Heba told us yesterday. And then the second one, as this was a specific request from you, will be more on focusing on how to engage with employers and what is kind of the interaction you can have with employers and so on. So today, job seekers, and then on the 25th, we will meet again and speak more about the engagement with employers. But as you know, as practitioners of public employment services, this is usually very much an interactive activity for us who work at PES. Yeah, so can you see the presentation now? Because I cannot see it.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. I will regardless start talking and
Okay.
then
It's coming up.
Here it is.
Perfect.
Yeah. So maybe we can go to the third slide, please, right off the bat. So next slide, please. And then next slide again. So we come to the third slide. Yeah, another one. We will look a little bit on the definitions on a global level from the perspective of inclusive labor market. We heard more of the global definitions and the UN system when it comes to persons with disabilities yesterday from Hera. But if we look at the foundation of an inclusive labor market, then we have, of course, the Declaration of Human Rights in Article 23, where everybody has a right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protect against unemployment, and to protection against unemployment. And looking then at the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Article 27, state parties recognize the right of persons with disabilities to work on an equal basis with others. This includes the right to the opportunity to gain a living by work freely chosen or accepted in a labor market and work environment that is open, inclusive, and accessible to persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. So one of the main problems when it comes to these kind of things, especially when you're connecting persons with disabilities to the labor market, is that there is no universal definition of different types of disabilities. This is usually at the discretion of the national legislation and the national competences. So we have a definition of just disability in itself, but not really a definition of the different types of disabilities. And maybe that is also a good thing, right? Because the preconditions, especially connecting it to the labor market, can be very different in different countries. However, there is extensive research on discrimination, or I guess anti-discrimination, and that's where we have very clear definitions instead. So, for instance, looking at the UN CRPD, discrimination on the basis of disabilities means, as you can see here, any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of disability, which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis, again, with others, of all human rights. And we already saw the right to work, right, in the Human Rights Charter. And of course, then also the fundamental freedoms in political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. It includes all forms of discrimination, including denial of reasonable accommodation. And we will look at reasonable accommodation a little bit more, because this is a very important principle for persons with disabilities. So reasonable accommodation means necessary and appropriate modification and adjustment, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden where needed in a particular case, to ensure to persons with disabilities the enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So reasonable accommodation is very much the basis on which we build disability inclusion in the labor market. Then you have the concept of universal design as well, complementing this reasonable accommodation. And then universal design means the design of products, environments, programs, and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Universal design shall not exclude assistive devices for particular groups of persons with disabilities where this is needed. And we will look at these kind of assistive devices, especially when it comes to workability and inclusion of the labor market. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, please. So we will look at different country cases, examples from different regions and countries. So as I already said, there's no global definition of disabilities, but also in countries like, for instance, within the European Union, who have quite advanced public employment services and also a common labor market with the free movement of workers on that labor market, there's no common definition of disabilities either. And I think this is very important to understand that even within countries who have very, very intense cooperation, especially within the labor market field, there's still no common definition for disabilities. And this creates an obstacle in that manner. Looking then at different parts, for instance, France has a quotation system quite similar to the one you have in Indonesia, but there is also penalties connected to that for non-compliance. So when employers do not hire a certain percentage of persons with disabilities, they have to pay a penalty to the government, and the government then uses that penalty money to make incentives or create programs and such thing for persons with disabilities to be able to enter into the labor market. So almost like active labor market programs. South Korea is another example, and they have one separate and one integrated system in their public employment services. So they have one agency focusing specifically on persons with disabilities, but then a state agency, but then they also have an integrated system within the public employment services as well. In Eastern Europe, you have a very strong tradition of categorizing persons with disabilities into different categories, and it's done by the state. It's, of course, together with the health system, but it's very limited for the public employment services to kind of influence the way persons with disabilities are categorized. So it's rarely connected to the development of the labor market or how the labor market is performing. In Sweden, where I come from, the public employment services actually has a sector responsibility within the functional impairment policies to integrate persons with disabilities into the labor market. So that's a very strong and long-standing commitment and responsibility that was given to the PES in Sweden by the government over 30 or 40 years ago. In China, we can see there is an active promotion and adaptation of services, even in this kind of centralized system, but then decentralized into the very vast country and the very vast number of persons that Chinese PES is serving. In Vietnam, we see a very strong commitment at policy level, and there are specific measures under development, but it's not very implemented throughout the country still. In the Philippines, there is a favorable hiring environment actually for persons with disabilities, but the adaptations in themselves are very ad hoc. So this is just a very scattered different examples from different regions and countries. So I just wanted you to have the image that this is not a similar practice that is mainstreamed or something within a country where you can see one solution fits all or anything like that. Next slide, please. So even within the European Union PESs, we can see that there is a very different way of approaching specialized services for persons with disabilities and very different approaches from the public employment services, even though they work within a common labor market. Next slide, please. So what are the key components for a public employment services? Public employment services is basically the safeguard of the inclusive labor market. A public employment services will deal with all customer groups, all job seekers, regardless within a country. So it doesn't really matter where the job seekers are coming from, but PES is there to serve everybody, right? It's a service. We can see that regardless of the general unemployment rate within a country or economic development in a country or how the labor market is even performing in the country, the group of persons with disabilities still needs targeted policies and services for them to be integrated into the labor market. There is a need to look for this group, and I think maybe for like different vulnerable groups that we see are further from the labor market and need more support from the public employment services. But then also particularly for this group, there needs to be a holistic and integrated approaches and support, because policies are good. There might even be a lot of employers who really want this kind of diversification within their operations to hire persons with disabilities. But if there's no infrastructure for a person to get from A to B, for instance, with the physical impairment, then that kind of good incentives isn't enough, right? So there needs to be this kind of holistic view from the entire society that this is important. And why is this? Oh, sorry, I think someone is, maybe if you can mute your, yeah, thank you. And this is very important then to look at the holistic view, but then also move from passive to active support. So we should never underestimate the cost of inactivity and the cost from society also when it comes to, for instance, social benefits, or when people are dependent on their family members so family members can also not perform work or perform jobs, right? So this kind of costs and indirect costs are also very, very high for society when we don't have this active support. What we can see also for people who fall ill and become functionally impaired or disabled because of an illness or because of an accident is that early activation is very important. It's important for these people to start thinking about coming back into the work environment, coming back into the labor market very early on in their rehabilitation. And we will also today discuss the focus on workability and the focus on how to focus on workability rather than the disability. Because for us working for public employment services, we care what kind of work people can do, not really what kind of disability they have, right? For us, it's important to understand the needs of the labor market, the demands of the labor market, and then bring them together. Next slide, please. So I think Heba talked a lot about this yesterday also, but this is more than the barriers faced by persons with disabilities in relation to public employment services and the labor market. So there are, of course, different barriers, and here we have categorized them as attitudinal, institutional, and participatory. So attitudinal barriers refer to any occasion in which prejudice norms towards disability affects the employment of persons with disabilities. So examples of this include prejudice in employment designs, decisions, or acts of microaggression also in the workplace. So also what Heba told us a lot about yesterday, these kind of preconceptions of what a person with a disability can do and cannot do, right? Instead of them actually telling us, we already made up our mind. Institutional. An institutional barrier refers to any physical, administrative, legal, and bureaucratic obstacle which prevents persons with disabilities from participating in the labor market. And these institutional barriers are, and we heard that from Heba also yesterday, are usually the ones that we focus on. But that doesn't mean that they are less important. They are very important to address as well. But they need to be kind of accompanied by attitudinal and participatory barriers reduction as well. A participatory barrier refers to any obstacle involving persons with disabilities in the design of employment support measures. This includes actively seeking input from persons with disabilities to ensure support materials, for instance, meet client needs, venues like step-free entry, and tools are suitable and physically accessible for use of persons with disabilities. And then, of course, also language is appropriate. And we heard yesterday also very much questions about, for instance, how do you work with physical disabilities and how do you work with mental disabilities and so on. And we will continue to discuss that also today. Next slide. So what can then PES do? One of the key components where we can see that public employment services are actually making a lot of headway when it comes to this is that there is a very strong inclusion strategy within the PES. Very much anchored both on a strategic level, but also within each person working within the PES knows about this inclusion strategy. It's strong. You're able to monitoring and evaluate this strategy and its implementation to make sure that you can also kind of adapt it as services are developed. Then to have this inclusion strategy translated into internal policies aimed for staff within the PES to understand what the strategy means for them within their normal work, right? Then you have this strategy also translated into external policies aimed at persons with disabilities and employers, so both services, and then if you have that opportunity also to have active labor market measures or active labor market programs. And here you can see the foundations that we spoke about earlier also with the reasonable accommodation to ensure that reasonable accommodation is kind of translated into the everyday work of the public employment services. And then when it comes to both job seekers with disabilities and employers, of course, you also have these outreach and partnerships components. So these kind of 6 areas of actions also needs tools to be connected to them to support the participation of persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. Looking at then how does the normal work of an employment officer or employment specialist as yourselves look like? The job seekers come into like entrance or first services, right, within the public employment services. And then here there needs to be an assessment of the job seeker on where they should go. There is a possibility to construct within the public employment services, almost like an internal remittances charter, let's say, where you can actually have a job seeker come to like an employment advisors, like all of us, or you could also have them go to a person within the PES who is an employment advisor, but also is more specialized, for instance, in working with persons with disabilities, like being able to do a workability assessment or so. Within this slide, if we press one more time, there should be a green square coming down around specialists or specialized employment advisor or MMPs. This is very much also conditioned to what the public employment services look like already in a country. Is these features already there, or are they possible to develop? Another way of working also with job seekers with disabilities is that they come to the public employment services and you have very strong partnerships with external partners who are already specialized on persons with disabilities that can also help you make the workability assessment or the assessment of this person's disability for you to have almost like a report or equivalent on the person to know, okay, so what are their obstacles, but also what are their abilities, right? So all of this together then can hopefully bring the job seeker, although we know that the journey of a job seeker within a public employment services, a job seeker with disabilities has usually a longer journey before they enter into employment, but hopefully all of these kind of forces within the internal, but also with the help of external partners, if that's how the PES wants to work, can then lead to employment either by support with the work adaptation or other types of incentives for hiring this person that is available in the country. Next slide, please. So the important thing is when you see a slide like the one I had before, it looks like a lot. But the person, it's very important, especially when you are developing these kind of services, who will also be services that you kind of reform or adapt over time constantly. It's never kind of done. The first step that, and the first question to a job seeker should always be, tell me about your experiences, competences, and skills. And this is very much setting the basis for being able to kind of understand the workability of the job seeker. So, and this should be no different if you need a job seeker with a disability or a job seeker without a disability. The important information for public employment services is always the competences, the skills, and the experiences of a person, not what kind of obstacles are there, right? Then, after this question, there needs to be an assessment of the job seeker in itself. What does the labor market look like? How can the job seeker meet the needs of the labor market according to what they have told you about their experiences, competences, and skills? And where can the job seeker use their personal resources in an inclusive work environment? Sorry, now I think someone's talking again.
Yeah.
Thank you. The second question is then when you have asked the first question, you have done the assessment yourself. The second question is, tell me if and how your health issue or impairment prevents you from using your experiences, competences, and skills. So also to hear from the individual, what do they see as obstacles for themselves when they have a disability? Next slide, please. So going from this step-by-step approach, we look at workability or reduced workability. So we look, of course, at the individual's capacity and competences. We look at the environment, the general conditions, and the accessibility within the workplace that they are qualified to do. And then we look at the tasks that the individual is supposed to do. And when you put all of these together, then you have your workability. This is how you can see a person's workability and go beyond looking at the obstacles, but looking at what is feasible. Next slide, please. So workability or reduced mobility, if you don't put all of these three together, the environment, you look at only the environment or general conditions and the accessibility, or you look only at the tasks, or you look only at the individual's capacity and competences, there will be a gap. And then you will not be able to see the workability in this closed context. So this kind of setup or this kind of tool, it can be a report, a questionnaire, something within the PES that you use, is there also to ensure that you can, in almost like not an easy way, but in a simplified way, start looking at workability from the first meeting with the person. As we are so many today, I have a little bit of a question for you, but I think maybe the interpreter can help me if I post the question and then help me. I don't think it's possible for us to break up in groups, but I wanted to let you see a case. So meet Anna. Next slide, please. Sorry. So meet Anna. Anna has a high school degree, just a normal one without vocational training. She just took normal high school courses and has no official profession in that manner. She has some experience of working at a nursing home for elderly people, and she also volunteers at her daughter's football club. She has a disease that causes pain, but also reduced mobility. And Anna needs support to find out more about how she can use her skills at work, how her disability affects her work ability, both in the short term, but also in the long term. So all we know now is that Anna has a disease that causes pain and reduced mobility. So my question to you is, when you see this, does Anna have reduced work ability due to her disability? And does she need support to be able to find suitable work? And then can you see if there are needs of competence on the labor market that could fit her profile at this point? Maybe you can write in the chat or something, just your first thought. It doesn't have to be a whole elaborate thing, but rather like just looking at this, what do you think? Does she have reduced workability? And does she need your support? And is there a need for her in the labor market? Is there something coming in? Sorry. As I don't read your language, maybe someone can help me. Yeah. She does not need. Mm. Yeah, I think, yeah. 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 I think maybe we need to also not read all, but thank you very much. And thank you for reading me, but I will then have the transcript of everybody. So thank you also for all of your interactions. Just for time wise, we'll stop there. I think all of you are right, actually. With this kind of scarce information, it's very hard to decide, right? Either it could be yes, either it could be no. But at this point, I think we have to just talk to Anna a little bit more, right? And ask her more questions to see if what is happening with Anna. For the exercise today, I think we talk to Anna a little bit more and we find out, yes, she does actually have a disability that actually affects her ability to work. So this is just a case, it's a made up case, but for argument's sake and to be able to continue, we say, okay, she has reduced capacity to work, and she needs our support, and she needs specialized support or individual support. Because from the experience of working at a nursing home, especially as she has pain and reduced mobility, this is not a valid option for Anna to continue her career in that. So we have to look at other things for her. Next slide, please. So now we have basically said, okay, Anna does have a disability. And due to her disability, we find her a job together at something called KG Products, where she will be more working with administrative tasks. So looking at what she can be eligible for, and her employer can be eligible for support, is, for instance, grants for aid at the workplace, like an adaptive keyboard for the computer to make sure her bodily pain doesn't increase. And she also, we can also make sure that we support the employer when it comes to costs for arrangements at the ground floor to make the workplace accessible for Anna to get in and out of the workplace, right? If there are wage subsidies also, this could also be, for instance, considered in Anna's case, because she might have, at least at first, a low working pace. It takes her maybe a little bit longer physically to get into the workplace or the work tasks. She also might need some time for rest more than her equivalent or her coworkers, right? And she might also need adapted tasks to ensure that she doesn't overload herself over the day, but rather can also work, for instance, full working hours and so on. But then it's very important, and I think this bubble coming from Anna also speaks a lot, that even though she has found a job at KB Products, I think it's also very important to look at what kind of career guidance does she get? Does she get from PES? Does she get from us? Will she is our job just to find any job for her? Or is our job to find the right job for her, to make sure that Anna also does not have to return to the public employment services another time because the job that we found for her was not sustainable, or it's not possible for the employer to keep her. So I think, especially coming from public employment services, we always look at how we can make our clientele not come back to us, which is, I guess, a predicament in itself. But what we are working for is for people not to have to use our services, right? So it's important also to very much focus on, when you are doing a placement like this, which is adapted for a person specifically, to ensure that you are also in connecting it to giving career guidance and career advice for the person as well. Not just to have a person, because they are disabled, to be at one working place and be happy with that, but also to ensure that they can actually also advance in their career to the equivalent to any person who does not have a disability. Okay. And next slide, please. So let's see. In a very developed working process within a PES, this could be Anna's journey, right? She signs up through a digital registration at the PES and gets information about disability as well. Maybe she has medical records that can be transferred from the health department to the PES. There would also be maybe interviews both with an employment advisor, but also maybe with a multi-competent team within PES, or also taking in external partners, as we talked about earlier, to see how we can help her further come. come along. And then this kind of team would also make recommendations on how she can move forwards, right? So she would take different steps towards work, preparation. She would also be matched towards, I guess, new work environments for her. She would maybe be activated through different things. Maybe she needs, especially if she's going in more into an administrative profession, maybe she needs to learn how to type faster on the keyboard or something like that. Maybe there's also a possibility for an internship or for work experience placement within KB products or another employer that we find suitable for Anna to explore this type of career. Then we can see maybe we or the service provider, whoever, but I think it would be Public Employment Services here, finds this job opportunity at KB products and provides, we provide information about Anna's needs for support to the employer to see what they can do. And then together we handle the work analysis, the assessment, the decision if there's any financial support going to the employer, and also, for instance, if there needs to be a workplace adaptation or an aid, right? And then when we have done these steps, which are quite elaborate, I understand, but when you have done this, Anna can actually work at KB Products on the same conditions as her colleagues without having discrimination or work harassment or things like that in the ideal case happen to her, but rather she would just be seen as any other colleague who is in the workplace and doing the job on the same conditions. So this is of course the best case scenario, but it's nice to see that if you have this step-by-step approach, even though it might take a little bit longer, it's still valuable to put in that time to make sure that the person with the disability actually not just get into a work environment, but the right work environment. Okay, next slide, please. There are different active labor market programs or policies for persons with disabilities. I put them in here and you can all read them afterwards also. But I wanted you to see this kind of differentiation where you can hopefully have tools or develop tools that can be closely connected also to the support that you give for persons with disabilities. So sheltered employment, I think the name in itself shows what it is. It's basically a placement that is done within a sheltered work environment, usually with a subsidy to an employer and or the employee. Some on-the-job training and support is usually provided, and this can prevent the critical transition to open labor market opportunities for the person to actually get used to a more of a work environment and so on, to make sure that the step from being unemployed to being employed is kind of bridged over. These kind of schemes can ensure adequate working conditions and labor rights for persons with disabilities, and also kind of is part of the social economy of a country. And the social goals provide a good framework to make labor markets more open to persons with disabilities, also to show the capacity and the potential within persons with disability. Job carving and job crafting is increasingly cited as positive alternative to sheltered employment schemes. And they differ with regards to working conditions, labor rights, career development, and facilitation of transition to the open labor market. So this is more of a maybe a little bit more intense when it comes to resources, as the job carving or job crafting for the person is very individualized, but at the same time, it's a quicker way than a sheltered employment, for instance. So it's cost efficient in that way. Supported employment is offered to assist people with disabilities in obtaining and maintaining paid employment in the open labor market. And the supportive measures ideally include assistance to the employee and employers before, during, and after the job is obtained. And then, of course, wage subsidies are there, and they can be provided by PES or tax authorities and targets all persons with disabilities. and they are characterized by a subsidy to an employer offering employment in the open labor market, but then with the subsidy. So I just wanted to mention these ALMPs that are more directed towards persons with disabilities specifically. However, it's obviously not up to me how these things work in Indonesia, but I think it's important to understand that these are there. Okay, so next slide, please. Looking at the different tools and methodologies, there are different ones. I included from the Swedish PES the Pathfinder, which is an online tool which a person can almost do a self-assessment of their own to see what kind of competences and skills they have and what kind of professions these competences and skills actually adhere to or answer to, right? So I think it's important to also make the person in an autonomous way for themselves also to find out what could be suitable for them, and not PES staff serving persons or job seekers all the time, but rather also making sure that they can almost do like a self-service. We already spoke about wage subsidies. There are activity-based evaluations of work capacities as well. If you have that kind of opportunities in the country where they can either do it within the PES or actually do it outside of PES and in an actual work environment. There is work-related psychological testing. There are, of course, hearing and vision function testing, work adaptation. And then, of course, and we saw this very much increase after the pandemic, naturally, but also in different crises, these video services provided by public employment services. And these can, of course, connect employers and job seekers, but they are also very good for people who might have, especially mental disabilities or something where, for instance, social environment can be very straining and so on. So for many people, video services can actually be a very good way of accessing public employment services. However, I show you now 7 tools. So I'm sure there's many, many more. But the thing is, when you chose one tool or one methodology, you also have to be aware of that each tool and methodology comes with its own training and competences for PES staff to be able to support job seekers and employers. Of course, in addition to this, there's also a need to have back office functions like rules, processes, procedures, etc., to enable equal treatment through the entire PES. And as well as we need all PES staff to be aware of disabilities and being able to work with persons with disabilities. And as I think we have an assessment that there is about 15% of the entire workforce globally. So it's important for all of us to understand the basis and so on. It's also important to understand that some PES staff also needs to be specialized. So we as PES staff also can rely on our colleagues who are specialized to give us support and give us recommendations on how to work with individual job seekers as well. But the equal treatment comes back here, and that's very important. Enable equal treatment. That should be the focus. Next slide, please. So we do have different challenges, of course, and especially with persons with disabilities, these come up very much. We know, for instance, that female persons with disabilities are very much less than male persons with disabilities participating in the labor market as well. So gender components are also very important here. There might be also other circumstances like economic crisis, war, internal conflicts, things like that. And when these things happen, they affect persons with disabilities disproportionately. So if we are all affected by these things, persons with disabilities are affected even more greatly. There's also a tendency for us to focus like, oh, a person has a disability. And we heard that from Heba yesterday, like, oh, this person cannot see, this person cannot hear. but usually a person isn't in, well, not usually, we're all individuals, and there's usually more than one vulnerability happening. So for instance, as I said, gender components is one. So if you have a female who is also functionally impaired when it comes to hearing, those are two vulnerabilities all of a sudden. And those kind of things happen all the time. Like you might be a migrant, but then also have a disability of some sort, or you have one physical impairment, but then also one mental impairment, for instance. So these kind of multiple vulnerabilities also creates a little bit of a more intricate and more challenging environment. And we speak a lot about the importance, especially also at the ILO, but at PES in general, like the importance of work mobility and also work migration. Because labor migration is one of the key components of having the global labor markets function in a good way, right? But also work mobility within the countries can be very important for people to be able to move from one place to another to respond to the demands of a city, for instance, versus the rural areas where the city might provide more opportunities for work. And this kind of work mobility is very important for the development of the domestic or the national labor market. But we also have to look at, is this actually feasible or accessible for persons with disabilities? There might be additional challenges for persons with disabilities there. I underline with Anna's case also the importance of career paths and career guidance, to not look at persons with disabilities in any other way than you would any job seeker, to ensure that they not only get a job, but get the right job where they can also prosper and have a career and actually advance in their life. And then we also have to look always at the cost of inactivity, because there is a cost connected to the individual person who is inactive, but usually that inactive person also depends on other persons who then also are affected in their workability or their activity in their daily life, right? So they might not also be able to take up work or take up activities to the fullest extent because they have a care responsibility for someone who is inactive and so on. So this kind of cost of inactivity, and to calculate that, is very important when trying to argue for more funds for public employment service to stand for this inclusiveness that we spoke about at the beginning. Next slide, please. So we go into the key factors and the starting points. So these are awareness, assessment of national challenges and opportunities, what has been done so far, identify important stakeholders, competences, conditions for supporting job seekers and employers to enhance disability inclusion, and objectives and outcomes. I will go through these slides a little bit more quickly, but you can also look at them afterwards. So awareness. So everything starts here: human rights and rights of persons with disabilities. Yes?
Yeah, so I think the colleagues are showing the previous slide, if they could pass to the next one.
Sorry, it's slide number 21, sorry. Thank you, Freddie. So everything starts here. Awareness, human rights and rights of persons with disabilities. What is the general opinion in the country? And how can PES then deal with the preconceptions and the prejudice that is already there? And how can PES reach out to employers and focus on competence and not disability? Next slide, please. Assessment of national challenges and opportunities. So the PES also needs to be very aware of what laws exist related to persons with disabilities when it comes to employment, anti-discrimination, quota legislation, assigned civil servants on different levels of government, and all of that. That needs to be kind of mapped out by the PES. How is the accessibility in society and surrounding environment? We also spoke about infrastructure, for instance. Is there access to social services like health, education, and so on? Can PES work together with them? Yeah, so this is very much also one of the things that needs to be done by PES. Next slide, please. What has been done so far? So what does the PES have to build on? So has there been international projects in your country on this topic?
Excuse
If
me
yes,
again.
yeah.
I'm sorry, Anna, to
No,
interrupt.
it's the next slide. Yeah.
Next, yes. Two after.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. And the next
Next.
one again. Sorry. I'm looking at my other notes here. Thank you for the next one again. Thank you. So has there been international projects in your country on this topic? If yes, what were the outcomes? And if yes, what were the lessons learned? To also have that kind of mapping. Next slide, please. So this is a very time-consuming task, but once you have done it, you will have a very good partnerships map and a partnerships relations with everybody. So look at if there are disabled persons organizations in the country. Are there NGOs in the country that provide service or employment for persons with disability? Are there healthcare providers available for persons in need of vocational rehabilitation? Are there employers organizations that can be supportive? Are there trade unions that can be supportive? Is education on different levels available for persons with disabilities? And what about a vocational training? We saw that with Anna as well, right? Can persons with disabilities join ordinary vocational training, or are there training centers available for persons with disabilities? So either or. And this kind of mapping will be very much the basis on which you can build on to be able to do this, what I spoke about before, this internal referral systems, and have this strong strategy where everybody is involved and everybody can kind of come together for the common goal. Next slide, please. Are there national competencies? So are there national centers of competency in vocational rehabilitation? Is there competence within PES in vocational rehabilitation? Or are there private providers of support to persons with disabilities? So very much connected also to this partnership mapping, but this more than coming into the more hands-on environment for persons with disabilities getting services from PES. Next slide, please. Conditions for jobs, supporting job seekers and employers to enhance disability inclusion. So the preconditions in your country: what financial possibilities does the country have to cover grants and subsidies? Or does the state budget already cover ALMPs for persons with disabilities or grants for workplace adaptation? How do they work, and can they be developed according to your knowledge? Okay. Next slide, please. Objectives and outcomes. What do we want to change, and where do we want to start as a PES? How can we identify small steps that can also be evaluated? Because that's very important to monitor and evaluate what you're doing to ensure that you can have this kind of constant reformation or development of what you do. Maybe also identify a target group like disabled females, people in rural areas, or your young persons with disabilities, whatever is the need for at the moment within your country, and start with them and not the entire population. So again, this step-by-step approach, and then you can expand. Next slide, please, number 28. So what are the conclusions and recommendations? To work in partnerships, to utilize the persons with disabilities, usually also as staff of PES can be very important for them to actually tell the PES what they themselves are experiencing, and then you can actually adapt your services and your operations accordingly. Develop a strong strategy and specialize the specialized services, so ensure that you have specialization also within the public employment services. And then the step-by-step approach and evaluate. Next slide, please. Just general observations and trends is that better economic situation in a country equals more integration efforts and more flexible policies usually, especially for public employment services. There is a connection to social protection when it comes to persons with disabilities and them engaging in the labor market. And there are also these kind of conditionality trends, where people get a benefit, but they also have to be activated to continue getting that benefit. Focus on workability is the most efficient way of working. Impacts on other policy areas such as social security and family dependency. We spoke a lot about that, the cost of inactivity. And regardless of the general unemployment rate in the country, regardless if it's high or low, this group still needs targeted policies and services. That's proven through all the research and everything. And one thing I also want to kind of talk to you about, especially from personal experience also with the Swedish PES, is that once you start communicating about you as a PES wanting to do something for this target group, this will spark debate also in society. So be prepared. There might be people who says like, why should they get specialized services when we have so many unemployed or so many in the informal economy and so on. So be prepared to have arguments also for this. I want to conclude with that everyone in the working age can contribute to the development of the society. Employers, municipalities, and government have a special responsibility to support and make it possible for people with disabilities to find suitable work. The basic principle regarding disability policy is that all people, regardless of any disability, should have the same opportunities to participate in society and enjoy their rights. So I also included the next slide, slide 30, as a group discussion for you also to have internally for the future, to ensure that you can have these kind of discussions also internally in the future. Next slide, slide 31, please. Are there any additional questions or comments or things like that?
Ana Karin, thank you
Yeah.
very much for this. Thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation and also for the examples and the details provided in the pathway, for instance, in the pathway route for remittances and as well as the general context that you provided. I propose for the questions and answers, colleagues, if you could include the questions in the chat. So we will take 2 questions at the time, and much appreciated if the translator could translate 2 at a time. So we will give a space to Ana Karin to answer. And I think because of the time, we can take 3 rounds of questions.
Thank you.
So. Let's see, there is one question on the. See one question in the chat.
Freddy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I will share the presentation, no worries.
We have also connected Mrs. Heba Olev. So in case there is also any question on Heba, yeah, thank you very much for connecting.
Terima kasih Bu Ana. Jadi ini sudah ada beberapa pertanyaan. Bisa kami sampaikan ya dari Pak Agus Isnanto. Bagaimana cara mempekerjakan tenaga kerja disabilitas ke pemberi kerja? Mungkin bisa dibantu untuk jawabannya, Bu Ana. Terima kasih.
I think we will also discuss that on the 25th a little bit more, where we will focus also on kind of the business case on
Okay.
making employment services also available for for employers. So maybe I will leave that question for the 25th, where we can have a more in-depth discussion on that, I feel. Thank you.
Oke, baik. Selanjutnya dari Pak Irwan dari Jember. Langkah apa saja yang dapat dilakukan untuk meningkatkan kesadaran masyarakat terhadap kelompok disabilitas?
I think that's also a question you need to kind of combinedly answer within your organization as well. So if Bina Penta can also maybe develop this kind of strategy that I was speaking about, which needs to really be anchored within the organization, but also within all the employees to have a basic knowledge about this. However, I think also when it comes to raising awareness of persons with disabilities, maybe it's not the role of PES to actually do that, but rather raise awareness of persons with disabilities and the really good contribution they can be in a workplace, in the labor market. So I think it's also very much focusing on the expertise of public employment services that you all possess, which is on job seekers, employers, labor market facilitation, and then work on that awareness raising for persons with disabilities. So within your area of expertise, this kind of labor market development component that PES stands for, and then bring in persons with disabilities. Because I feel like we need to focus as specialists on workability, on the labor market development and what kind of contribution in development that persons, regardless of disability or not, can bring to the labor market or an employer. So I think very much anchor it within our own specialization. That would be my suggestion.
Ya, izin Miss Ana untuk menyampaikan pertanyaan dari peserta. Izin bertanya, penyandang disabilitas merupakan salah satu pekerja rentan. Bagaimana strategi ILO untuk meyakinkan kepada pemberi kerja atau perusahaan agar mau menerima pekerja disabilitas? Dan berapa persen tingkat kepatuhan dan komitmen perusahaan tersebut yang selama ini ditangani? Terima kasih.
Yeah, I think when it comes to hiring, and I'll go into a little bit what we were discussing on the 25th as well. When it comes to speaking to employers, I have a good couple of slides next time that I can show, but also I can give you a hint on it now. The way to engage with employers is the same way that you do with any employer. You engage with them and you get this long-standing commitment, and I think you also already went through this in the online training. But the thing is, there's extensive research and extensive evidence that if you have an inclusive working environment within a company, then the company actually develops more. It gets more productive, and it has new ideas, new insights from people with different backgrounds, with different abilities. And that means that the employers themselves are actually developing more. One other idea is also to ensure that you do a couple of placements really well, especially for persons with disabilities with a couple of employers. And then you also use those employers to speak to other employers, almost like a mentorship. But I will speak a lot more about this on the 25th as well. But I think the engagement with employers is always to show them that they can actually grow from and showing how they can grow from hiring persons with different abilities, with different perspectives and so on. Because a diverse working environment always increases productivity. That's what we see. Yeah, sure.
Terima kasih, Miss Ana. Kami persilahkan bagi teman-teman atau Bapak Ibu yang ada di Zoom, bila ada pertanyaan atau yang perlu didiskusikan. Oh, dibaca aja. Ini ada pertanyaan dari Justiana.
Thank you
Setiap
very
dinas
much.
tenaga kerja wajib membentuk unit layanan disabilitas. Wadahnya sudah ada, tinggal dikembangkan. Baik.
Yeah. So that was the competences of PES staff. Yes. I think it's important to, as I said, with the step-by-step approach also, to maybe have a specialization also not just generally on persons with disabilities, but then maybe also on different parts of disabilities within the PES staff as well. Because not everybody can be a specialist on everything, right? There needs to be a general knowledge, and I think that's what we're creating here in this webinar series as well, and hopefully beyond. A general knowledge, a general basis within all PES staff on knowing how to serve persons with disabilities in general. I think that's super important. And that needs to also be a continued training, almost like a yearly thing where you get this kind of sensitization or training on to keep it fresh, let's say, in your mind. Another thing is that if you opt as an organization to have specialized employment counselors for different disabilities, then, as I said at the end, maybe start with a specific target group within the disability persons community as well. And make sure you do those services really well, evaluate them, and then take on another group and so on. So to make sure. And I think it's important to understand that not all staff have to be specialized in this way, but rather you can have certain staff that also acts as remittances partners for their own colleagues. So they can also make recommendations to their colleagues like, oh, you could do this or you could do that. You know, you could do it this way or you could act in this way to make sure, or you can contact this employer and so on. So I think it's important to understand that you as an organization also kind of have to decide on what kind of structure you want internally and then try to use it as fully. But then don't be afraid to also evaluate what you're doing and making sure that it's the most effective one, or also maybe change if it's not the most effective one. I hope that was the answer to the question. Thank you.
Is there any other questions from the audience? I see. If we could take perhaps a couple of them, I mean, those that are more common, and if you could translate them. I see a hand raised. I don't know if the colleague wants to intervene or it's just she forgot to put it down. Mrs. Despa Novita Snacker. Yeah, if you could please read two questions and group them, those two that are more common, please. Thank you.
Halo, izin bertanya.
So on the first question, yeah, I mean, if we could get of course, the answer from Anna Karin, but also insights from Inda.
Yeah, on the regulations, I'm not sure because obviously I'm not an expert on Indonesia as you guys are. So I don't the national competences, you possess those, not me. On when it comes to specialization, I think it's a matter of structuring in kind of looking at what you want to do as a PES. If this is a priority for the PES as an organization, to get more engaged with persons with disabilities and ensure an activation of that, then I'm sure that a specialization in-house would be good. But of course that's also resource intense, so you have to look at that perspective also from PES, you know. And then maybe if you do this kind of stakeholder analysis, stakeholder mapping that I showed you as well, there might be already resources out there that you can also capitalize on. So don't be afraid to also see if there are NGOs, OPDs, and things like that that can help you advance on this agenda and make sure that you also have a strong strategy, but that is flexible enough to be evaluated and also developed over time. So I think it's those three components, whether you have specialized people in each office or not, that I also feel is more of an internal question that you yourself have to kind of think about and then prioritize as you see fit according to the needs and the demands and the priorities that you have. Thank you.
Inda, could you help us with the answer to the first question, please?
Ya, ini mungkin dari Ibu atau Bapak UPI ya, dari Disnaker Kabupaten Bandung. Jadi situasi yang ada ditanyakan, sudah ada implementasi Undang-Undang Nomor 8 Tahun 2016 di perusahaan, tapi banyak perusahaan tidak mengindahkan. Ya, terus walaupun ada juga beberapa perusahaan hanya menempatkan beberapa persen saja. Jadi yang ingin tanyakan bagaimana langkah-langkah yang harus dilakukan. Jadi kalau memang dari aturan, memang di aturan kami di Indonesia itu memang mewajibkan gitu ya untuk perusahaan bisa menempatkan pencari kerja disabilitas itu sebanyak 1%, dan bagi institusi pemerintahan itu 2%. Nah, kondisinya kenapa sulit gitu ya? Kalau yang memang kami lihat selama ini memang tersosialisasinya memang masih kurang gitu ya, pemahaman mungkin perusahaan juga masih kurang, tapi belum tentu sepenuhnya mereka juga tidak mau, tapi mungkin mereka belum tahu ya harus seperti apa. Mungkin pengalaman di Heba kemarin yang sudah dijelaskan di presentasinya bahwa pada dasarnya tidak mahal gitu ya untuk kita bisa memberdayakan pencari kerja disabilitas gitu kan. Memberikan fasilitas itu tidak mahal dan tidak perlu menakutkan untuk perusahaan. Nah, hal-hal itu seperti itu mungkin perlu dilakukan oleh pengantar kerja untuk mensosialisasikannya. Nah, lebih detailnya mungkin nanti Bu Ana mungkin bisa menjelaskan ya saat kita sesi yang ketiga ya, karena itu merupakan pelayanan kepada pemberi kerja ya. Jadi istilahnya kami juga mungkin butuh diberikan kayak strategi, tips-tips gitu ya untuk bisa meyakinkan gitu ya perusahaan untuk bisa menempatkan pencari kerja disabilitas. Mungkin seperti itu, Freddy.
Yes, we will discuss that for a full hour next time as well. So yeah, we'll go more into the employer side and the engagement with employers a lot more in the next session.
Thank you very much. I think we have a space for one final question before concluding this session. So if you could please take one from the chat.
Ini dia menanyakan gitu ya. Dari ya, untuk beberapa pertanyaan yang sifatnya terkait dengan perusahaan atau untuk klien pemberi kerja, nanti kita keep dulu pertanyaannya. Kami akan simpan, nanti akan dijawab ya Bu Ana ya di sesi yang terkait untuk pemberi kerja ya. Jadi biar nanti bisa lebih full untuk penjelasannya. Kemudian ya ini dari NTT, dari Pak Zem. Tantangan kami di Provinsi NTT tidak tersedianya pemberi kerja. Oh, ini sama ya, pemberi kerja ya. Bagaimana mungkin yang poin nomor 2-nya untuk pengembangan kompetensi bagi disabilitas, jika dianggarkan untuk pembebanannya pada daerah akan sulit. Bagaimana solusinya? Mungkin tadi Bu Ana sudah disampaikan ya, kita mungkin harus bisa kolaborasi. Dan untuk pertanyaan ketiga, bagaimana kami membangun komunikasi dan relasi dengan lembaga publik lainnya? Apakah hal ini boleh sebagai pengantar kerja? Ya, pada dasarnya sepertinya boleh ya Bu Ana ya, seperti yang tadi sudah dijelaskan. Mungkin ada yang mau direspon, Bu Ana? Silakan.
Ini kakak dipoto sama Bang Wei. Bang Wei.
Anna, if you agree, we can take that question. And I see there is also the hand raise from Despa, Novita Ditnaker.
Siap, baik. Izin Pak, mau bertanya.
Silakan Ibu.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih atas waktu dan kesempatan yang diberikan kepada saya. Izin kami dari Kota Batam, alhamdulillah sudah berupaya untuk menjalankan Undang-Undang 8 2016 Pasal 53, yaitu perusahaan swasta wajib mempekerjakan penyandang disabilitas 1%. Kami sudah berupaya itu, Bapak dan Ibu, alhamdulillah. Di sini cuman kendalanya perusahaan sangat welcome untuk mempekerjakan penyandang disabilitas. Tapi dalam hal ini perusahaan mengatakan, karena di dalam undang-undang juga perusahaan wajib membuat sarana dan prasarana. Nah, itu yang menjadi kendala bagi perusahaan karena mereka harus menyiapkan sarana prasarana. Dan dalam hal ini mohon maaf, ini saya sudah mengambil jalan pintas mengatakan kepada perusahaan untuk apabila disabilitas yang akan dipekerjakan dengan akses dan sarana prasarana yang ada di perusahaan tidak menghambat oleh disabilitas itu untuk melakukan aktivitas di perusahaan tersebut, kami mengatakan silahkan saja. Itu mungkin apakah ini kami menyalahkan ini ya, karena kami berupaya dengan hal seperti itu ya sangat terbantu. Kalau perusahaan mengatakan kalau memang seperti itu, mungkin kami bisa menerima penyandang disabilitas untuk tidak wajib dulu mempersiapkan sarana prasarananya. Jadi itu mohon maaf apakah kami dari Kota Batam melakukan hal tersebut, mengatakan kepada perusahaan bahwa apabila ingin mempekerjakan penyandang disabilitas, selagi disabilitas tersebut tidak mendapat kendala, tidak ada hambatan untuk melakukan aktivitas di perusahaan tersebut, perusahaan tidak perlu dulu untuk menyiapkan sarana prasarana. Itu yang kami lakukan, Ibu. Jadi mungkin kalau melihat dari undang-undang kami sedikit menyalahkan, tapi dengan hal tersebut perusahaan bisa merekrut disabilitas yang ada di Dinas Tenaga Kerja. Itu Bu, apakah kami menyalahi dalam hal itu Bu? Terima kasih.
Okay, let's see if I can kind of navigate this, and then maybe you guys can remind me if I missed something. I think on the second one, I think that's exactly what reasonable accommodation is. The fact that you don't accommodate unless it's reasonable to do so for someone to take up work. So from my perspective, obviously, I don't know the specific case from you unless as you presented it, I think that's a good example of reasonable accommodation, where if it's reasonable to accommodate, then yes, if not, then you don't do it, because if the workability is there, then you don't have to accommodate. So for me, it's a good thing. On the other ones, now I get a little bit sorry if I can see it. I think it's important to understand that try to utilize the resources that you have in-house together with each other also. So because they are already here in this room, as you hear, and I also can see very experienced colleagues who have already done things like this, but just described, or something like that, that can very much also be utilized by the others, you know. So when someone has an experience of already placing a job seeker with a disability, talk to your colleague, ask them what did they do, what worked, what didn't work, and then you can start applying that also in your everyday job, regardless of specialization. But of course, I said that already in my presentation as well, that specialization is one of my recommendations, because I feel that it can be a little bit overwhelming if all staff needs to do exactly everything that, you know what I mean? So like, to have specialization and have colleagues who are specialized is one of my recommendations, just because of that. A general basis for everybody to have knowledge, but then specialization with some colleagues. When it comes to engaging with partners and so on, I think that's always a question, but usually from my experience, engaging with other partner organizations like NGOs, OPDs, and so on, they are usually very, very open to collaboration and cooperation, because they are already struggling when it comes to serving their groups, right? So I think it's very important to maybe see if you can utilize your common forces. When it comes to other ministries and other parts of the government, I don't obviously know the prerequisites within Indonesia and how it works, but I think it's very important, and that's a voice that I have been trying to raise for many years, is the fact that there is a lot of expertise already within a PES. You as Manpower, or Bina Penta, I think, you already possess a lot of expertise and information already within your ministry, within your organizations, within the implementation that you have already done. And one of the important things of that expertise is also to provide it to other parts of the government so they can actually see. Because I think it's easy if you're within the health branch to just look at the disability, while if you're within the Ministry of Labor, your task is to actually make the labor market function better and get people into employment. And that's your expertise. And if you can bring both of those expertise and talk together, usually you have a better outcome. So I think that's part of it. And as I said, also, for instance, with infrastructure, with things like technical assistance and so on. And if you can bring this expertise to higher levels, to other or horizontal levels which you can interact with, then the argument of also maybe having a bit of budget going into this, because it's a priority of the government, because it's a priority of society, to have these people more integrated in society, then the budget should be provided for that as well. You know what I mean? So that's the argument, to also get maybe more funding for this target group and so on. But working together and working in partnerships will always be important. And that kind of dialogue will always be important. And you will always maybe run into people who feel like they know more about this than that you do. And probably sometimes they do. They do know more about persons with disabilities, but you know more about the labor market, and you need to bring those two together. So I think that's the main partnerships and dialogue is usually my case, but also to bring the expertise of public employment services to the level of the decision makers and make them understand that you do possess a lot of information and expertise. I hope that answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you very much, colleagues, for these questions, and of course for the interest and active participation in today's session. We saw a maximum of participants of 363 today. And as it was mentioned by Ana Karina and Diego also, we will be having the next session, which is the 25th of March. So we look forward to have your active participation. We will be discussing the role of the public employment services and employment counselors in the inclusions of people with disabilities in the labor market. Particularly the services to the employers, the partnerships, as we heard today from Ana Karin, the importance of coordinating with other institutions and government as well as non-governmental institutions, and then the team strategy. So thank you very much, and we look forward to see you on the 25th of March at 2 p.m. Jakarta time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Have a good day.
Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Ana untuk presentasinya. Terima kasih juga Freddy dari ILO, dan Bapak Ibu sekalian, kita akan bertemu lagi seperti tadi ya, tanggal 25. Untuk pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang masih belum terjawab nanti bisa ditanyakan lebih lanjut di sesi yang terakhir, di sesi yang ketiga, karena memang ada beberapa pertanyaan yang terkait dengan perusahaan atau pemberi kerja, jadi nanti akan bisa dibahas lebih lanjut. Sampai bertemu lagi, salam sehat semua, semoga semuanya lancar, dan terima kasih untuk perhatiannya. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Waalaikumsalam
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Ya.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mbak Indah.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Sampai ketemu lagi.
Terima kasih Mbak
Thank you very much.
Indah. Selamat.
Baik.